Welcome to the latest CBH Talk. My name is Tabitha Fritz. I am one of the board members of the Canadian Business History Association, and I'm here today with author Patrice Dutil, author of the book Sir John A. Macdonald, The Apocalyptic Year of 1885. Interviewing and speaking with Patrice today will be CBHA President Joe Martin. Joe?
Greeting audience, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Patrice. He has an extraordinary background, but of all the things that I like about him, I consider him a personal friend. And when we get to this specific book, I can tell you where and when I was when I finished reading it, because I was in bed just before midnight of December 31st, 2024. So it was the last book I read in the last year. Patrice, something you may not know about me is that I have adopted John A. Macdonald.
Now, I didn't know that.
And the way it came about was I'm a great fan of the Dictionary of Canadian Biography.
As I am.
And I gave $1,000. And David Wilson, the editor, said, well, you know, you're allowed to adopt someone. And I said, well, that'd be terrific, but I'm sure the person I would like most is already adopted. And he said, who's that? And I said, Sir John A. He said, no. So I got him. And I guess I have a number of questions for you, but one question I've been thinking about, were you at the CHA meeting in Regina in 2017?
No, I was not.
Okay, that's the one where the Canadian Historical Association voted, I think, 10-1 to change the name of the McDonald Prize.
Yes.
In spite of a very eloquent defense by one or two scholars in the room, I had deliberately left the conference and was well east of Regina on the Trans-Canada Highway because I was afraid that would happen. And one of the questions, sort of a macro question before we get into the book, when did this anti-McDonald stuff begin? Can you
yes,
know?
Absolutely. Yes. Well, Joe, thank you first of all for inviting me on this podcast. I really appreciate it, and thanks for shaming me into raising my contribution to the Canadian Dictionary of Biography. I'll have to raise my my contribution. There are the antipathy towards Sir John A. Macdonald has been brewing for a number of years, but it really started with the with the publication of James Dashuk's Clearing the Plains in 2012, 2013. Dashuk's very careful, actually, in his book, in attributing a great deal of blame to Sir John A. Macdonald. At one point, and I bring it out in my book, he says, you know, it's obvious that the government of Canada did not have the tools necessary to deal with the enormous difficulties faced by the Indigenous on the prairies in the 1880s. The technology wasn't there, but that doesn't stop him from using the claim of clearing the plains and attributing some blame to Macdonald in his not in his book but in his pronouncements. That planted a lot of seeds, and I have real trouble with Dashuk's book. I don't hide it in my own treatment of Sir John A. Macdonald, but that claim of Dashuk's really snowballed, and then the report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission came out in October of 2015. So just after the celebration of Sir John A. Macdonald's 200th anniversary, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission came out with its report, and of course, as we all know, really castigated Canada for the establishment of the residential schools, notably in Western Canada. And even though Macdonald is, again, not singled out for blame, because Sir John A. was at the beginning, necessarily he had to be blamed. And I think that from there, we had a really an enthusiasm for Sir John A. Macdonald's condemnation, which peaked with the unfortunate murder of George Floyd in May of 2020, and from there grew out even more angst about residential schools. And from that point, you see a public condemnation, schools being renamed, John A. Macdonald schools being renamed, streets being renamed, initiatives blunted, initiatives to name things in honor of Sir John A. Macdonald blunted, and that's been continuing since then. The Government of Canada has not put an end to it, nor have any provincial governments put an end to it, even though they are both in a position to do something about it. And as a result, 9 of the 11 statues that had been erected in honor of Sir John A. Macdonald have been removed or destroyed. So, I mean, if you're asking me, where does the anti-Macdonald fever comes from? Well, it's from those two sources. But again, there were also, discomforts about Macdonald brewing elsewhere. The net effect is that 10 years after many of us celebrated the bicentennial of Sir John A. Macdonald, we have very few landmarks in his honor. And as we speak here in mid-February of 2025, the Toronto District School Board is actively lobbying to remove the name of Sir John A. Macdonald from a high school in Scarborough. So it continues.
Yes, well, it's indeed unfortunate. You can see I have 2 collections of books, one in Toronto, one on the countryside. One of my bookcases behind me, the very top are my books on Macdonald. Every book there is about Macdonald. And I have been a fan of him. Really, I think it was right around 1960. I think it was then, and I heard a great speech in Winnipeg by John Robarts about Macdonald.
Yeah.
And been a fan ever since. When I was president of the Manitoba Historical Society, which was 1967 to 68, I convinced the society to introduce an annual Macdonald Day. Well, when they abolished that, nobody bothered to inform me. I found out by accident. But it's all very frustrating. So.
But Joey, I mean, what's interesting here is that you're a Westerner, you're a Western boy, you're a boy of the prairies,
Right.
And the claim out west is often goddamn the CPR and a blaming of Sir John A. Macdonald for somehow hamstringing the development of the Western economy. How come you're so different?
Well, first of all, there's a lot of mythology, and I never met a person on the prairies. I'm talking from the small villages.
Mm-hmm.
I was born in Kelvington, which is, I guess, known because of Wendell Clark and his cousins, the Melrose boys.
And also because of Joe Martin, of course.
I doubt that. And didn't live there very long, moved to Leroy, Saskatchewan, formerly Bog End. And our farm was in between, about halfway between, but just west of the Manitoba border. But I never heard anyone claim that they preferred to live on a CN line rather than a CP line. So I hear those stories about the CP, but let me tell you, I was glad that we lived on the CP line, and I was sorry that in Calder, Saskatchewan, practically on the Manitoba border, it was only serviced by CN.
Mm.
And
of course, you also fell under the spell of John George Diefenbaker, who's an impassioned friend of Sir John A. Macdonald.
Yes, he is. Yes, he was. And when I stepped down as president of the Manitoba Young Conservatives, Mr. Diefenbaker was very generous, and he gave me an autographed copy of Creighton's 2-volume history.
Wow.
And Deef had that wonderful flourish, and I subsequently got it signed by Donald Creighton, and
Oh.
also by Tommy Tweed. I don't know if you remember the play that was done, The Dream.
No.
It was taken across Canada in 1967,
Ah.
and students got to see it. In Winnipeg, we had the performance at the auditorium, which was a huge venue. So John A. was definitely there. And of course, his son moved to Winnipeg and eventually became lieutenant governor, briefly premier.
You're talking about Hugh John. Yeah. Hugh John McDonald.
That's right. So, so let's leave it at that point. I guess one of the things I find interesting about your book, and I think the audience would like to know, is you've chosen a single year, and I would like to know not only your reasoning around that, but having explained that to us, why 1885?
Well, this book came out of a previous study. I published a book called Prime Ministerial Power, Its Origins under Sir John A. Macdonald, Sir Wilfrid Laurier, and Sir Robert Borden. That was a book I finished in 2017. I published in 2017. While I was preparing that book, and this is a book really about leadership, right? A subject that you and I really care about. The year 1885 kept coming up. Now, of course, I've studied, as you have, the Riel Rebellion of 1885, the issues around the completion of the CPR in November of 1885. But there are other issues where we've built some knowledge. The issue around, for example, the Enfranchisement Act of 1885. And then, so I said to myself, this might be an interesting device, dare I say a literary device, to bring a new audience to Sir John A. Macdonald. My purpose on this is naked. I think that Sir John A. Macdonald was a wonderful leader. I think he was a gifted leader and a real gift to Canada. Forgive my romanticism in that regard. But I wanted to showcase his leadership. So bring all these things together. And I started looking into 1885. And sure enough, every month seems to be offering a new problem, and a major problem that is still with us today. Sir John A. Macdonald in 1885, has to deal with Grover Cleveland, a new president of the United States who has certain designs on Canada. He immediately announces that U.S. ships will have free access to our ports in the Maritimes and on the West Coast. Like, wait a minute, this is not right. We have claims by Britain that Canada should be involved in the Sudan. Again, so Sir John A. is there, tackling the two angles of the Atlantic triangle. On one hand, Britain making demands. On the other hand, the United States making demands. Does that sound familiar? Then we have the issue of the Métis resistance in the Saskatchewan River, the threat. And this is something that Macdonald feared above all, an Indian war. Sir John A. Macdonald absolutely dedicated himself to the task of avoiding an American-style Indian war, where we know that the violence there practically annihilated the Indigenous people. Macdonald's philosophy from the very beginning was completely different. This was not going to be a military operation. It would be a colonial administration for sure, but it would be a police-led, a peacekeeping operation. And so he created the Northwest Mounted Police as a result of that, with the ambition that the Northwest Mounted Police be composed of course, settlers, as we call them now, but also Métis and Indigenous people, really to bring peace, order, and good government. Anyway, that comes into 1885. The completion of the CPR comes into 1885 because Macdonald's cabinet's divided. They've poured so much money into the CPR, and the CPR is still there in the winter of 1885. Cap in hand, we need more money. We need more money. And Sir John A., he's had enough of this. But on the other hand, he knows that his dream cannot be completed unless the government offers more guarantees. And so it does. And that's an issue. But then on top of that, while all this is happening, so John McDonald decides that what really is the issue for Canada is an expansion of the franchise. Oh, what do you mean expansion of the franchise? Well, I'd like women to have the right to vote. Women? In 1885? So John McDonald is the only statesman advocating that women should have the right to vote. I mean, it's remarkable. And then he says Indigenous people should have the right to vote. Are you serious? Indigenous in 1885, while Riel is challenging the sovereignty of the government of Canada? Then there's the issue of the Chinese immigration, and so I go into that. Then to top it all off, Joe, you have the issue of smallpox, a smallpox plague that, again, an issue still relevant to our day. And I was writing this book, in my basement, hiding away from COVID-19, dealing with smallpox, which claimed close to 6,000 lives in Quebec in the year 1885. 6,000 lives. So wrap all this together, and you have a tumultuous year that includes all sorts of other things, including the first baseball cards that feature cabinet members. And I opened my book with that. So there's all sorts of stuff that makes the year 1885 worthy of a close attention. And through that, an opportunity to examine Sir John A. Macdonald's leadership. How did he deal with all this? Did he win? Did he lose? I think that 1885 is a fascinating case study of his leadership and how he succeeded, how he had to deal with life and death issues, major financing issues, and a galaxy of issues that are still recognizable to us today. So I thought that put together, it would make for a very interesting book, a provocative book, because I am in defense of Sir John A. Macdonald.
That is a great overview, and I don't think I did not know, Patrice, that you were a baseball aficionado, as am I. And so I promised to the moderator that I'm not going to take this off course, but very exciting to have a president in the story who's the only president I know who had a great ball player named after Grover Cleveland Alexander.
Yes.
But if we get off baseball, back to Grover Cleveland and indeed to the UK, one of the things I really liked, you're dealing with a single year, but also you do a great job of setting context by dealing both with the British demands, Sudan, etc., and with the American situation, and bringing out, because it's not unnatural that Grover Cleveland should be thinking the way he was, but this is now an independent country, and I think you make that very clear.
Yes.
You've got another organizing principle, which is fascinating, and that's the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. Please tell me about that.
Well, again, it occurred to me as I was writing this book, as you know, I was writing about and researching about this cascading effect. You have that the image of the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse came to my mind. You have the horse that brings war, and that's Britain. You have the horse that brings internal discord, and I would say, that would be Louis Riel. You have the horse of famine, and then you have the horse, and we have famine. This was an opportunity for me to deal with the issue that Sir John A. Macdonald had deliberately forced people, to death by starvation. And so this was an opportunity to address. That didn't happen in 1885. If anything, the figures show that from 1885 onwards, the figures of death by food starvation are eliminated. And I suspect that that's because we finally have a CPR that can transport food efficiently and quickly. But I have an opportunity to deal with that issue. And then the last one, of course, is the final horseman of the apocalypse, which brings plague. And of course, there, as I said earlier, we have a smallpox epidemic, a deadly smallpox epidemic in Montreal. It happened in Montreal because the French Canadian Catholics did not want to be inoculated, did not want a vaccination. And this was their fault. The government of Canada did look after the provision of vaccines for the people for which it was responsible, namely the Indigenous people. And there are no records of Indigenous people dying in 1885 of smallpox, certainly not in the area of Montreal. Of course, there are little outbreaks of smallpox every now and then. And the government of Canada, at that point, remarkably, is fairly good at containing it because we have inoculation. And that's the federal government's thing, and that's John A. Macdonald's doing. And too often, in our condemnation of Sir John A. Macdonald, we refuse to recognize, or we just, out of ignorance, don't recognize his vast efforts in terms of public health. Again, at a moment when we are deeply respecting jurisdictions. It's the province's thing to look after public health. It's not the federal government's thing, except for the Indigenous population, because Ottawa is uniquely in charge of the Indigenous file. So, for him and his ministry, it's a passing thing, but all the same, it's important to capture that reality. When we talk about the Riel rebellion, all things told, all things calculated, it led to the death of about 100 people. Compare that to the 6,000 people who died in Montreal, mostly children, by the way. I think it helps put the Riel rebellion in perspective.
Okay, well, I want
The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, in other words, to answer your question, the
Right.
Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse corresponded very neatly to the challenges that Sir John A. Macdonald had to face that year.
Right, and I want to continue this a little bit because dealing with conquest and the white horse, I did not realize that there was some talk about Jamaica becoming part of Canada, and of course it wasn't that much later. I think that it was Laurier provided boatmen in Egypt, didn't he?
Who did what? Sorry.
Laurier provided boatmen in the war in Egypt.
Okay, no. So what Sir John A. Macdonald compromised, where he compromised was this: if somebody in Canada wanted to raise a battalion, a regiment, whatever troop, he was not going to stand in the way. And so there were again, and it's important to bring this out. 1885 is really the birth of the imperialist movement in Canada. The imperialist movement being a profound sympathy with the British Empire, the perception that English Canada in particular, but maybe Canada in general, had a sense of belonging within the British Empire. That to borrow Carl Berger's phrase, imperialism now became a Canadian nationalism. And 1885 is really the birth of that. We have to remember that 1885 really is 1884, 1885 is when this flourishing of imperial sentiment really starts to catch fire. It's been there since the mid-19th century, since Britain's taken over India. But now that you have a race to carve Africa, it assumes a much bigger importance. So yeah, Macdonald will allow for a few hundred boatmen to travel to Egypt, and they will go. A lot of them are Indigenous people from the area around Montreal, and they'll go, and none of them will see action, Joe. I mean, it's they go to Egypt, they get terribly sick, and they come home, and that's it. But what Macdonald did, though, was important in that year. I mean, he basically told the British government that we're not going to be involved in your adventures, your foreign adventures. Don't count on Canada for that. And it's an important moment because he basically signals to the imperialists, the budding imperialists, that Canada has priorities of its own, and it will not be swayed by imperialist dreams. Laurier comes in 15 years later, and faced with the Boer War, basically invokes the McDonald doctrine and says, no, we're not sending anybody. It splits his cabinet. People are very angry with him because the imperialist movement has really fermented in those 15 years, and English Canada absolutely wants a participation in defending the empire in South Africa. So Laurier will go a little bit further. He'll say, okay, we'll allow for some militia to go to South Africa, and we will pay for their transportation to South Africa, but we will not do any more than that. They have their own equipment, and they have to work their way back to Canada on their own, and they'll be part of the British Army. You go another 15 years later, that's in 1899, you go another 15 years later, and again, you can see how the imperialist movement has now become full flower, and there is no doubt in Sir Robert Borden's mind that now that Britain is at war, Canada is at war, because the political pressures were such that opinion in English Canada would never tolerate anything less than a total commitment.
But before we go to the next question,
yeah.
in the Boer War, of course, Lord Strathcona came to the rescue with the Lord Strathcona horse.
Yes.
I happened to have spent a summer with Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, and Hamilton Galt wrote a check for the government of Canada at the time of the First World War. I mean, we were at war, but he said, okay, I'm giving you a regiment, which is quite extraordinary.
It is, and it's a testament to the fact that it's the population. Well, it's a strong element of the population that wanted this, and it's really pushing the government to act. Because again, to be a realist for a second, Canada had no interest in the South Sudan. Right. And Canada had no interest in the Boer War either. I mean, there are no national interests at stake here. But the English speaking, and again, and the studies have shown that the most adamant champions of Canadian participation were either British immigrants to Canada or the children of British immigrants to Canada. And they were numerous. Canada had just gone through a formidable boom in the late 1890s and in the early years of the 20th century, and it was British immigrants who really fueled that movement. And
referring back to the article I did for you for the Champlain Society,
yes.
that rubbed off on the ethnics, and they very much saw that they had to show that they were loyal to the British Crown, and so it was like, I don't know if you remember, but I had three uncles in World War I, and they called it the Viking Battalion. But let's stay with this period.
Yeah.
Talking to the Red Apocalypse, you give that very early in January, February, I think it was. Why didn't you save it later when the fighting began?
Well, the Red Horse of Discord, that's Louis Riel. Well, I mean, I deal with it with chapter 4. I tried to follow the chronology as much as I could. In the winter, it just so happens that McDonald is dealing with the British Empire and with Grover Cleveland, because Grover Cleveland is inaugurated in early March of 1885. And you have at the end of March of 1885 the declaration of war by Louis Riel against the Canadian government, his creation of the Excommunicate, his little republic on the Saskatchewan River, and the attack at Duck Lake. So I mean that seemed to me, again, if I follow the chronology, that's where I need to deal with it, and I deal with it. I mean, again, the months blend into each other, but I thought this would be an opportunity to delve into the reality of Indigenous assistance to Louis Riel, which was by and large non-existent. And that gives me an opportunity to look at the issue of malnutrition and starvation in the McDonald the McDonald government leading up to 1885. The reality is, Joe, that, as you know, the Indigenous did not support Louis Riel. There was one terrible massacre at Frog Lake where some of the warriors in Big Bear's band committed atrocities, committed murder, and they were eventually brought to trial and they were hanged in November of 1885. But that was the extent of it. Big Bear himself refused to participate, pleaded with his young warriors to desist. And the rest of the Indigenous population, the rest of the Cree, the Blackfoot, led by Crowfoot, also refused to participate. They had very little respect for Louis Riel. They knew, well, in their hearts, they were quite hostile to the Métis because they saw them as competitors for territory, for land, and ultimately for the buffalo hunt, which had disappeared by that time. So there's no good relationship between Métis and Indigenous, and at that time. So it's an opportunity to bring out some of those tensions.
Well, and the other thing, and I've just finished reading Jerry Friesen's superb biography of Norquay.
Yes.
And I hadn't realized that there was as strong a division as there was between the Métis and the half-breeds. And that was quite pronounced. And the question I had to you in terms of the Riel Rebellion, were you aware that John Tory, when he was mayor of the city of Toronto, sent an apology to the Métis Federation?
Yes.
And we sent troops?
Yeah, it's really something, and that was continued under Mayor Chow. It was a big to-do in December over Louis Riel Day, and I noticed her total silence on Sir John A. Macdonald's birthday. Yeah, as a society, our leaders take interpretations of history, and some of us may agree with it, some of us may disagree with it, but I find it deeply ironic that, but it goes to show that, again, Toronto's changed, but again, I think it just demonstrates an ignorance of history.
Yeah, well, I guess the thing that really surprised me is my friends in Manitoba were very conscious of Mayor Tory's action, but when I mentioned it to anyone in Toronto, they were all shocked and surprised to learn this.
Yeah.
So, but let's go to Black. Now, you've already talked about Dashchuk, and I think that could do with elaboration, and it's just not just Dashchuk. There's also Sarah Black. Sarah gave a paper in Banff in September, and I read her paper in Prairie History, and she rails on a bit about the Robin Hood flour mill in Moose Jaw, and also, what a villain, what a villain sort of the English-speaking people were.
Yes.
And ignoring totally, and she clearly doesn't understand the Foresters movement, which came out of the fact that when the Normans conquered Britain, the Saxons had to meet in secret in the forest, and they'd pass around a hat and they'd put in a penny to cover the cost of the funeral. And probably one of the most famous people in this country of First Nations birth was the founder of the International Order of Foresters. And his statue was in their beautiful building across from the old what was the Ontario Museum of Technology. So there has been tribute paid, but I guess not the way she wanted it. But if you could just expand on what you said earlier about the implication of Dashchuk and other people's work.
Well, this is an important part of my book, and I want to capture Sir John A. Macdonald's leadership on this issue. The notion that's floating out there is that Macdonald either actively cleared out the planes or passively made sure nothing happened. And what I bring out in the book, and this is nothing new, but it's just a matter of synthesizing things a little bit, is the reality of Sir John A. Macdonald as a policy entrepreneur. When he comes back to power in 1878, triumphantly on the national policy, Macdonald sets himself up as Minister of the Interior and as Superintendent of Indian Affairs. He could have ignored it, but he made it a personal priority. And dealing with the crisis on the prairies immediately raised the budget for Indian Affairs. And I document in the book how much it went up year after year after year. So John A. Macdonald is personally engaged. He makes himself minister for that portfolio. He increases the portfolio's budget dramatically to the point where it becomes the third or fourth largest expense in the government in his government through the 1980s. Sorry, 1880s, not 1980s, 1880s. He creates new programs of model farms. A few model farms are set up. He hires hundreds of expert farmers from the East who will go to the West and hopefully bring some instruction to the Indigenous peoples who are struggling with this historic turnaround. And this is the in part the tragedy of the Macdonald ambitions, but also its triumph. We're dealing with the reality here of Indigenous peoples, mostly Cree, but some Assiniboine also, some Crowfoot, some Blackfoot, who suddenly can no longer chase the bison. The bison is no longer there. It's been decimated mostly by the American army and settlers. The border has hardened. The Americans are not allowing people to cross the border back and forth. And so the Indigenous people through the 1870s are literally frozen and freezing because they're not moving around. They can't go to the mid US and find refuge from the cold. Again, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but the fact is that their movements have been cut off. And so, the government of Canada sets up reserves, and that's a dispute on its own. But in those days, the land allotment is quite generous. It's again, let's remember, we're dealing with about 15,000 people here. Right? It's not a big population. It's important to remember that scale, about 15,000, maybe 20,000 people. We don't have a clear number. The point of my book is that Macdonald does make it a priority. He makes himself minister. He raises the budget dramatically, and he creates programs. Did those programs work? A lot of scholars have shown that it didn't really work, that after 1 or 2 years, a lot of these instructor farmers went back because the conditions are horrific. There's drought, there's extreme cold. It's extremely difficult. People have pointed out that the allotment of instruments, of tools to break the land, to bring techniques to the Indigenous people are not working. At the same time, scholars have also demonstrated that there are, in fact, many model farms of Indigenous people who are breaking records in their harvests that are doing extremely well. So it's a complicated picture. My point simply is that you can't say that Macdonald didn't do anything. He did a lot. And if you look at the actual count of people who were victimized by starvation, well, and I did that using Dashuk's book, I come down to a few dozen people over 5 or 6 years. I'm willing to be challenged on that. I'm not using my figures. I'm using somebody else's figures. But there it is. So a lot of the allegations against Macdonald, I find, are unsubstantiated. And that's an important part of the book.
Well, I guess I think you've done a real service there and a few others because, and I thought of my own understanding. I said, while I was a supporter of Macdonald and his policies, I'd never thought through that whole issue. But as you said, what was happening on the Canadian plains was truly catastrophic.
Yeah.
Because of the of the buffalo herds, and of course they were being slaughtered for their tongue or their, in the
Hides, meats, you name it, horns.
so.
And Joe, it's important to remember that there are no social programs in those years.
Right.
It's not like we're dealing with the welfare state.
Right.
And I point this out in the book. I mean, children are in factories in Ontario and Quebec.
Right.
We have children working in factories. We have deaths, the maternity deaths, going through the roof. There's no health and welfare state. And yet Sir John A. Macdonald thought, well, these people are in real trouble and we need to do something. For me, it was McDonald who basically created state assistance for peoples that were in severe distress. That's never recognized.
Well,
and again, I'm not disputing the fact that it was not a perfect program. I'm not disputing that. Can you imagine how difficult it would be? Again, we're dealing with people in the 1870s, 1880s, to calculate how much food is necessary on the barren plains of Saskatchewan, when you don't even know how many people live there, and you have to ship the food, no later than mid-October because you can't travel. There's no railway, there's no travel, and you're going to have to calculate that food to last until May.
Yeah.
When you can again resume transportation. Well, I'm sorry, I think we have trouble today doing that. In the 1880s, you sure could not. And so it's not surprising that, and I've no dispute with the idea, with the documented riots that took place on occasion through the prairies when some Indigenous were in fact hungry and impatient, because there was no food, and they weren't they weren't growing very well. And McDonald says it time and again: we want these people to be farmers, but they're really slow in adopting modern farming techniques. And and it's from there, of course, that you have the growth, the idea of residential schools. Today it's condemned as assimilationist and as colonist and the worst motivations. But all McDonald was trying to do is say, look, if we want to teach these people how to farm, then they need to learn the language. They need to learn how to calculate. And if we can't bring them day schools because they're located in very remote areas, then let's create residential schools. Again, 150 years later, we can say, oh, that was really bad. But the job of a historian is to capture the context, which is always so difficult to do. That's the art of history, is capturing the context, being true to the context, trying to put yourself in the shoes of the decision maker. And that's where I come to the conclusion, well, you can condemn McDonald for creating residential schools, but you have to understand what his motivation was. And his motivation was not annihilation. It was not genocide. It was simply to give them an opportunity to learn. And I think that most Indigenous people today would recognize that. They want education. They want to join the mainstream. That was John A. Macdonald's goal. And there's no doubt that, again, when we're dealing in the 19th century, we're dealing with people who are on a mission to Christianize. And that's understanding the 19th century. That was the mentality. But you have to be, I think, realistic and make an effort to understand where Sir John A. Macdonald was coming from.
Yeah. So if you get back to the public school system, I guess maybe the error we made in teaching history is not sufficiently explaining that rather than being something silly and irrational, whole policy was highly rational, because with this catastrophic decline in the buffalo, which was never to be changed, what were your options on the plains in the late 19th century? It was a place for agriculture, and as you know better than I, in the House of Commons, the Liberals were highly critical of anything he did for the First Nations. And my sense of reading Hansard is that people really saw that they saw the Plains Indians as much as very different than the Indians in Ontario and Quebec.
Yes, absolutely.
And
And McDonald saw them like that way. And again, to explain his bias, I mean, Sir John A. knew Indigenous people from Ontario, and I actually quote him many times in the book. They saying that the Indigenous people in the prairies should be like in Ontario. They are going to school and they are growing farms and they are successful. And when he says, "I want the Indigenous people to vote," I mean, he's not thinking of the Indigenous on the prairies. He's thinking of the people that he knows here in Ontario who should be participating in elections. As long as they meet the qualifications, Joe. I mean, as long as they meet the property qualification. Right. But so at the end of the day, his effort to give the Indigenous the vote is successful, with the exception of the Indigenous people in the prairies. That was an insistence that was demanded both by the Liberal backbench and by his own Conservative backbench. They did not want to give the vote to people like Big Bear specifically, right. But there was a compromise, and that was a noble gesture, and it was removed by the Liberals 10 years later.
Right. And I have heard what some people who are politically active don't appreciate is that if the criticism of the Donald continues to grow, guess who's going to be next?
Oh, I think it's
and so I think that's something we don't want to happen.
Well, but you're absolutely right, because every prime minister following Sir John A. Macdonald, thinned by omission. They did not change that. They did not change, until we had to wait for John Diefenbaker, right. Before the Indigenous were given the right to vote again. We had to wait for, in terms of the discrimination, the terrible discrimination against the Chinese. It took a Mackenzie King who had once barred immigration from China outright, right. In 1922. It took his conversion, his arrival on the road to Damascus to finally say, okay, I made a terrible mistake with the Chinese and they should be allowed to vote.
The most recent school renaming was up in Nova Scotia, and the principal statement is that it was being renamed because of the residential school system.
Yeah. And
if I recall, the first residential school in Atlantic Canada was in 1931. Yes. So John A. had been dead for 40 years, and how many prime ministers have been there in between?
We are, again, we're people of the New World, and our cousins, the Americans, are just as ignorant of their history as we are. But we're really in a bad situation, Joe, in Canada. You know this as well as I do. We do not teach our children our history. At least the Americans try. In most places in Canada, you're not required to take a Canadian history credit to graduate high school. It's a terrible thing. And most people will hear about Sir John A. Macdonald when they're either in grade 7 or grade 8, depending on what province they live in. And when you're 12 years old, you can't understand Sir John A. Macdonald. And so it's not surprising to see a condemnation of Sir John A. today, because the population is simply not aware of what Sir John A. Macdonald did, who he was, what he accomplished, and what he stands for. It's a terrible situation, and you're right. I mean, the City of Toronto District School Board wants to remove his name from a school, and incredibly, it's going to be up to the students. It's going to be up to the students of that high school to determine whether they want to change the name of their school or not. We're going to allow teenagers to make a decision. I am speechless.
Well, the Toronto District School Board has been a disaster as long as I can remember living in the city. So that's another issue. But
another issue. A terrible issue.
We're just about towards the end. I guess I have to tell you, with the Fourth Horsemen of the Apocalypse, I found that a staggering statistic, the one you put in, showing the difference between deaths in the city of Montreal, and I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, Kahnawake. I mean, and what you made me think of course, was the Canada didn't have a federal Department of Health until 1919.
Yeah.
And yet, and to bring out the point that in periods of crises, the First Nations were better off than their European counterparts.
Mainstream counterparts, yes.
Yeah.
Sir John A. Was perceived by there was a fellow, a Toronto activist, a guy called Plater, Playter, who recognized he was a real public health advocate, and he said when Sir John A. died in 1891 that whatever hopes he had to see Ottawa play a role in public health had died with Sir John A. And it's clear that among the many things that Sir John A. brought was an awareness of healthcare, of the responsibility of public healthcare. He did give subsidies to small societies across Canada who were promoting public healthcare, not public healthcare, I'm sorry, but public health, sanitation, things like that. To my mind, demonstrating once again his progressivism. That Plater would say, we lost it with Sir John A. Is telling of the many different commitments and the many different interests Sir John A. McDonald had, which are a reflection of his leadership. And that's what I wanted to bring out.
Okay, well, with you as we're drawing to an end, do you have any particular chapter that's your favorite, or any particular chapter that you didn't write and wish you had?
No, I think I was at war with my publisher because I submitted a much longer book to him than what you have in your hands. I have a lot more.
Feeling.
You know that feeling.
75%.
Yeah, it was cruel and it took time. The chapter I enjoyed the most writing, I have to say, which was a real discovery for me, was the vote on Asian immigration. Because there, Sir John A. McDonald said some terrible things about the Chinese. These were men who come to Canada to work on the railroad, and he said a few terrible things that have been misconstrued, I would argue, since then. He denied them the right to vote. But he made the case that, it was a political case. There's no disputing it. He did not want to deny the Chinese the right to vote. He crafted his bill, and there was never any thought of that. And it was only as he tabled the bill that he inserted an amendment saying that the Chinese would not be allowed to vote. It was a last-minute conversion, and he did it because he was hoping that his caucus would support him in voting for the rights of women. But it died, and the Votes for Women initiative died. But the demand that the Chinese be denied the right to vote carried on. At the same time, there's enormous pressure to limit the immigration of Chinese. There are very few Chinese in Canada. There's none of them are in the East. There are no Chinese in the East. They're all in British Columbia. And Sir John A. did impose a $50 head tax. And it's a terrible thing. And there's no denying it. It was discriminatory. There was no head tax on anybody else. It was a terrible thing. But you put things in context. There was no place on the Pacific Rim for any Chinese. So Sir John A. McDonald did not deny the Chinese the right to come in. He simply put a tax. We do this today. We charge potential immigrants twice as much as Sir John A. McDonald imposed in 1885. I actually made the calculation. It comes out to about $1,600 in today's dollars. Today, the minimum fee is $3,000, $3,500 just to put in your papers. So, we condemn John A. for doing something that we do today, except worse. And I think that you capture the moment when he's passing this law in the context in which he lived. And so John A. becomes not the villain that he's become, but actually becomes a progressive compared to the United States, where there was no immigration possible. Australia, New Zealand, the Latin Americans, Japan, you could not, if you were a Chinese looking for work around the world, you could only come to Canada. And I think that's important to remember. But the whole politics around this I explore in my chapter. He created a royal commission, and I describe all that. And I think it shows Sir John A. Macdonald in truer colors than the way he's being cartooned today.
And on that particular topic, I'd like to share with you that my wife and I are expecting our first great-grandchild in June.
Wow.
And her mother is from China.
There you go.
Yeah. So the world has changed.
Yeah.
Tabitha, over to you.
Yeah, I think all of that just highlights again how context is so important, just like you were saying, Patrice, in your comments about your book. And so, like Joe mentioned, that does take us to the end of our time today. So thank you both so much for your time. Patrice, thank you for your insights. Again, the name of Patrice Dutil's book is Sir John A. Macdonald and the Apocalyptic Year of 1885, if you're looking to pick up your own copy of the book. And on behalf of myself, Joe Martin, and the entire Canadian Business History Association, thank you so much for tuning in and joining us today. And until next time, take care of yourself.